Tonight, the war shaping a generation. A second night of violent clashes at universities across the United States. Tensions reaching boiling point over the situation in Gaza.
You do get the sense that this is the final stand of these protesters.
Turfed out, many from their own campuses, police flattening what was left of the students' tent city. We'll hear from a professor at one of those universities who insists her students have a right to be heard. And I'll be joined live by a top Palestinian diplomat on how events are being viewed by those at the heart of the story. Plus,
there's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos.
As Joe Biden slumps in the polls due to both his action and inaction on the Middle East, could this be the very moment that turns voters? That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening and welcome to a special edition of The World. Tonight we'll be focusing on the clashes that have spread across American universities. From the Ivy League to small public institutions, pro-Palestinian students have set up encampments to protest the war in Gaza. Many are also asking universities to divest from investments connected with Israel. Look at these scenes. Scenes of emotion, frustration, pure anger pouring out onto our screens. Students clashing with police and each other over a war taking place more than 1,000 miles away. So why has the situation in Gaza had such a profound impact on young Americans? And why, rather than looking to calm the situation, did some college administrations decide to escalate and ultimately start a war of their own? It's a story threatening to be fatal for Joe Biden's chances in this year's elections. Tonight, we'll explore just how much of an effect the president's stance on the Middle East is having on people in the region and voters closer to home. But first, Martha Kellner reports from the University of California on a day no one wanted to see repeated. And a warning, Martha's report contains flash photography.
Everybody back to the front! Hold the line! Hold line! Grab shield! Grab shield!
This is their last stand. One more push. But almost certainly not the final act in a movement which is sweeping this country. Police versus protesters. Many of them, but not all, are students. A mismatch, though, in heft and in hardware. One side equipped for a riot.
Let's go, I need shield!
The other for a rainy day.
We need a line on the tie, stay together, stay tight.
For a week, pro-Palestinian protesters occupied this part of the university campus.
Free Palestine!
One of the grandest buildings in one of America's most prestigious universities. This is what it looks like now. A makeshift medical tent, too, to treat the injured. The resolve of these protesters is now being seriously tested. Those at the front of this barricade are calling for helmets and shields as they try to stem the advance of the police. The police had already tried once to break up the protests.
Get back!
For many students, this is about much more than Gaza. It's about policing too. Police officers have just let off a flashbang device. It's used to distract these protesters as they prepare to move in and dismantle this encampment. But seemingly overwhelmed by protesters' resistance, they retreated. Celebrations, though, were short-lived. More explosions overhead. Police hacking down the fence guarding the encampment. Chemical spray was fired towards them.
This is absolutely ridiculous.
Then protesters picked off one by one.
They're students!
Rubber bullets were deployed too. At least one man requiring hospital treatment. The force used by police will be closely scrutinised. His people divided, a president forced to intervene.
Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. None of this is a peaceful protest.
A tense and violent few days here and on campuses across this country left some wondering how on earth to restore peace and order. Martha Kellner, Sky News, Los Angeles.
OK, let's go straight to our Mark Stone, who's at UCLA. And Mark, extraordinary scenes there in Martha's report from the situation overnight. You're there now. What's going on?
It's clearing. I mean, quite remarkable how quickly they have managed to clear the mayhem from last night. We're in precisely the spot where Martha was filming that report last night, and you can see the clear-up operation is ongoing. There are no protesters here now. They have been moved completely out. To the right of the shot here is Royce Hall. That was a building which featured heavily in all our coverage last night. You might just be able to make out some of the graffiti still on the walls of Royce Hall. But as we move round to the left from that building, you can see the clear-up work precisely where this extraordinary protest and clash with the police took place last night is all being cleared up. The question, of course, is what happens now. We know that a small group of protesters did return here this morning. 20 or so protesters came back this morning. They were quickly turned away. The police, the LAPD, are not here anymore. They have moved out of the area. The area is, we understand, in the control now of the university police and of university security. But they alone will not be able to prevent the protesters coming back. Look, Yalda, I think we are seeing the potential now for a confluence of different causes. Yes, of course, underlying all this is Gaza. But as Martha alluded to in her report there, the way the police have decided to deal with last night, the tactics that were used, I think that could rile things further. Here, potentially elsewhere as well. It could cause a confluence of causes, people being drawn down here, galvanising a wider protest movement potentially. And remember that there isn't any sort of centralised power in America where there can be some sort of coordinated policy of how to deal with these protests. It is up to individual police forces acting in many cases in response to what the presidents of the universities ask for. It is also, of course, up to the governors of different states. So many things coming together which could cause significant problems. And of course, the politics too, I haven't even got into that.
Yeah, indeed. As you say, we haven't even gotten into the politics, Mark, and I imagine we will continue to be talking about the situation there across the United States. Thank you so much for bringing us up to date, Mark. Well, let's just take a look at how all of this started. The protests erupted on the 17th of April at New York's Columbia University, when students pitched tents in the middle of campus and began rallying in support of Palestinians in Gaza. Police first tried to clear the encampment. A day later, this resulted in more than 100 people being arrested. It only heightened tensions. Anger then spread to other campuses, with police arresting dozens of protesters at New York University, Yale, and the California State Polytechnic. On the 30th of April, hundreds of police entered Columbia's campus at the request of the university president after students occupied the Hamilton Hall building and barricaded it. Those inside insisted they didn't pose a danger and called on police to back down. On the same day, protesters at Brown University agreed to dismantle their encampment as officials agreed to discuss and later vote on divesting funds from companies connected to the Israeli military campaign in Gaza. A very different approach. Well, a day after that, clashes broke out between pro-Palestinian protesters and Israel supporters at the University of California, Los Angeles. Now, meanwhile, across the US, hundreds of protesters were arrested on multiple campuses, including the University of Wisconsin and the University of Texas. Well, one of the big questions has been, did some colleges actually make an already bad situation worse? Well, I'm joined now by Nara Milanic, Professor of Latin American History at Columbia University. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us here on the program. We've been seeing the way things have escalated, have erupted. Of course, they all began at your university at Columbia. And I guess the question I want to put to you is, could the university president, could the staff there have handled things differently?
I think the easy answer is yes, they could have. So the encampments at Columbia started 2 weeks ago, as you mentioned, on April 17th. They coincided with President Shafiq, the president of Columbia University, appearing in a hearing, a congressional hearing that lasted 4 hours. The hearing was supposed to discuss anti-Semitism. Rampant anti-Semitism on campus was the sort of narrative that was being pitched. And the very morning of that hearing, students at dawn set up an encampment, which lasted less than a day because, as we know, President Shafiq called in the NYPD to arrest more than 100 students. And then subsequently, that encampment in a matter of hours rematerialized on an adjacent field. So this has been going on for several weeks. And I think one of the takeaways is that police repression simply does not work.
In fact, it has the opposite effect. I mean, we can see that something that was relatively sort of localized, a protest movement within Colombia, suddenly erupted across the country.
That's exactly right. I think that if President Shafiq had made a different decision when the first encampment appeared, rather than calling in the NYPD, if she had let the students alone and perhaps gone and visited the encampment and spoken with them and seen what was going on, we might be living in a very different country right now.
Do you think that would have been the case? Because it did feel at the time that the protesters were also, refusing to sort of budge and weren't wanting to move. I mean, there were all sorts of accusations at the time, people saying that there were anti-Semitic slogans being used, students being harassed, that they were, in the end, they were arrested. And I've spoken to students who say that they were accused of trespassing, but they also say they were peacefully protesting.
So I saw the encampment. The initial encampment only lasted a little over 24 hours, but it was entirely peaceful. And the one that replaced it was also peaceful. I visited the encampment, which I have to say President Shafiq, as to my knowledge, never did. And it had a little bit the vibe of a summer camp. Students were, of course, engaged in political activity, but they had a code of conduct to enter the encampment. They trained de-escalation faculty and students to keep in order to avoid conflicts and violence. They held a Passover Seder. I think it's very important to know that many of the students in the encampment were themselves Jewish. So this narrative that somehow the pro-Palestinian encampments are inherently anti-Semitic or harassing Jewish students is simply not the case. I visited those. I am myself Jewish. I visited the encampments. I observed what students were up to, and I can, tell they were blowing bubbles and braiding each other's hair. They held an anti-Semitism teach-in for one another. So I think.
Are you saying, Professor, that basically something that had a sort of a carnival feeling to it escalated when police confronted them, and then it kind of moved beyond just the protest around Gaza, but turned into something around free speech and how police were handling them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a question of free speech from the beginning, not just 2 weeks ago, but indeed this entire year. We've had a series of conflicts at the university regarding questions of academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of protest. We've seen the progressive hemming in of students' right to protest and to expression. For example, at my college, Barnard College, students were prohibited from hanging anything on their dorm room doors, with the idea being that anything they hang on their doors could be alienating to other students. So this question of academic freedom has been, and freedom of expression on campus, is one that has been with us this entire year.
Since October 7 and the situation in Gaza, or relating to other protests and demonstrations at Columbia?
That's an excellent question. I mean, on our campus, I think this really exploded after October 7th, but I think it relates to a longer and bigger story that's happening elsewhere in the United States with the suppression of academic freedom around other issues. So, for example, in my native state of Florida, we have seen how a Republican legislature and a Republican governor have attempted to assert control over universities, what they can teach, how they can teach, how you teach the history of slavery, for example, in the United States, the field of gender studies. These kinds of conflicts have been happening for some time now. I think what is different now is that we're seeing these similar conflicts riding into private universities in ostensibly progressive campuses, in ostensibly progressive cities and states. And that's something that we haven't seen before. Before now, it's been in public universities, primarily in so-called red or conservative states, that we have seen these conflicts over academic freedom and freedom of expression on campuses.
Professor Milanic, thank you very much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you.
Well, Professor Milanic was giving us a sense of the situation there at Columbia University. We saw earlier from Mark what's happening at UCLA now. But across America, protesters are still making their presence known. Let's learn more from our James Matthews, who's at George Washington University in DC. And James, I mean, we saw quite extraordinary scenes overnight at UCLA. And Mark talked us through the fact that they are very much, for now, ended. But what's happening where you are?
It's ongoing. There is a protest still in progress here, Yalda. Peaceful, I would have to say, very much in keeping with the thoughts of the president across town this morning. I'm in George Washington University, University Yard, in the neighborhood of this city that rejoices in the name of Foggy Bottom. But it's all extremely quiet. It's busy. It's busy. There are more than 100 tents. This tented encampment has been here for the past week. And in terms of public, they are coming and going. Certainly, students are here in considerable numbers. Security, not so much. Maybe you can see at the end of the lane, the one uniformed security in sight is one member of campus security. It's been busy here over the past week. Take a look at the university flagpoles. You can see the size of the Palestinian flag on one to the right. To the left, the Stars and Stripes, Old Glory with a Palestinian flag on top of it. But in terms of violent protest, damage to infrastructure and so on, no sign of that. There clearly has been elsewhere across the country. At UCLA overnight, there were 200 arrests. That brings the total number of arrests across university campuses in the States to 2,000 and more over the course of the demonstrations. Take a look at the message here, hands off our campus, chalked on to the pavement. Over here we have part of the program of the day is letter writing to Gaza, sending individual notes from individuals here to Gaza, messages of support. The program of the day gives you an idea of the daily structure for those attending. We've got letter writing, history of DC, the housing crisis, right down to 10 p.m. film screening of Between Two Crossings, a documentary about a young girl from Gaza who wins a scholarship to the United States but struggles to get across the border and fulfill that study. So, like I say, Yalda, around 100 tents. I'm looking at something 200-300 and more people, not all students, people just coming and going. This is a thoroughfare. You can see the statue of George Washington at the end, just by the street, with Palestinian flag draped on his back, kafia on his head. Kelly is a student here who's involved in the protest. Hi, Kelly.
Hi.
Thanks, you've agreed to talk to us. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
You're a third-year student of international studies. What is this a study in?
For me, this is a practice of international studies. I joined that major because I care so much about what's happening in the world, and to see our government contribute to the murder of 40,000 Palestinians is incredibly disheartening. To see our university fund that, that's why I'm here today, to make sure that we divest from that and we protect the anti-Zionist Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian community.
We'll keep talking to you, Kelly, as we have a look elsewhere around University Yard. Tell me, there is the concern, an extreme concern on the part of the Jewish community, Jewish students who say that they are intimidated by this. Messages like Intifada, not here, but that has been written elsewhere.
Yes.
How do you respond to that, that it's simply unacceptable and it's hateful and intimidating?
I think there's a lot of fear-mongering that does intimidate students, and I understand that. But I think the thing that has been the strongest message to me is that some of our strongest community members and allies are the Jewish community, and they often get overlooked, right? There's so many Jews who understand that what's happening what's being committed by the state of Israel is not in their name. And I had those conversations with Jewish Voice for Peace, which is here today. One of our students who was suspended is Jewish, right? Those people are often overlooked. So knowing that we have their support, knowing that that community is so integral in the liberation of the Palestinian people, that is what grounds me in knowing that none of that is true, right? That idea that we are a hateful movement is just not true.
Okay, and very briefly, Kelly, what do you make of the scenes that we have seen at UCLA, violent scenes in Wisconsin, in New York, and the police saying that they have proof and evidence that there are external actors behind that, people hijacking a legitimate peaceful protest to elevate it towards violence?
Well, one thing that we saw with UCLA is that outside agitators, largely Zionist communities, had come in and beat students pretty badly. It's really disappointing to see that both our universities and our government can't respond to that and condemn the violence against protesters who are almost all anti-Zionist. What we saw with Columbia a couple nights ago, what we've seen at UCLA is primarily Arab, Muslim, anti-Zionist students being targeted. So I do believe that there are outside agitators, but they're largely not from our community.
Kelly, many thanks for your time, much appreciated. So there you go, that's the picture, a peaceful picture, I have to say. Take a look at the tented encampment at University Yard and George Washington University, Yalda. Protest continues peacefully here.
And James, we will be coming back to you a little later in the programme to talk more about the political situation and how all of this is impacting Joe Biden and what he has to say. Thank you so much for now. Well, joining me here in the studio is Hannah Weisfeld, director of Yachad, which advocates a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. First of all, your reaction to what's going on in the United States.
Well, I find it interesting that the press is now entirely focused on students on university campus rather than what's actually happening on the ground. And it almost seems that, you know, we've forgotten that there is actually a war taking place in Israel-Gaza and that we're in the middle still of hostage and ceasefire negotiations. And yet now the focus of conversation has become about students. And in some respects, it's quite frustrating because really the focus should be on what's happening over there and is overtaken by the things we've just watched.
I mean, given this conflict has gone on for 7 months and, you know, as newsmakers, this is something that becomes increasingly difficult to capture the imagination of audiences. Do you think that this is a way to highlight what is actually happening on the ground?
Well, clearly those students think so, and those students have an absolute democratic right to protest. I think what has happened in America, and actually to some extent has happened on the streets of the United Kingdom, is this unbelievable polarisation, which is actually quite dangerous, which says, I'm either in the camp of supporting the Palestinian people, or I'm in the camp of supporting Jewish students who feel discriminated against or fearful. And you need to pick a side. And actually, once you've picked that side, that is the only side you can be on. And I think what it's doing is entrenching the conflict and making it actually much harder long term. Because there
to have nuanced conversations. To
have nuance. And there are many people, and I would say the vast majority of students, and polling shows that the vast majority of people in this country don't sit at either ends of that polarisation, but the polarisation is what most of us hear. So what we're seeing now, and that figure is actually quite shocking, that 2,000 people have been arrested. But actually it's still quite a minority of people in terms of, you know, the discourse on Israel-Palestine, but it's obviously visually and vocally the loudest. And I think what's quite dangerous about this whole conversation is that eventually what happens is that it's the people at either end of that polarisation. So, you know, whether it's protesters, counter-protesters, the people that are screaming the loudest, the people that have said the most extreme things that dictate the course of the conversation.
And as you say, the conflict continues and we are still hearing about ceasefire negotiations and, you know, the Hamas delegation going away to think about it, the Israelis going away and thinking about it. And this has really been the state of play for many, many months without any real resolution.
No, and I have to say, unfortunately, these protests, you know, Biden said, I think today or yesterday, it makes no difference to me in terms of what my decision and what I do with Israel-Palestine. And we saw, you know, headlines today, Cameron, you know, agreeing to sell weapons to Israel just 2 days after the British aid workers were killed. that the noise around the conflict and the reality of who's making the decisions is actually quite far apart. And really, I think that, you know...
So you don't think these sorts of demonstrations make policymakers sit up and think?
No, I think they do, but I think what's happened now is that they're almost divorced from the reality on the ground. The conversation about what's happening in America is actually about what's happening in America, and it doesn't really any longer have that much to do with what is happening in the region. And for me, the thing that I would really like to see is getting people out on the streets in support of the people, you know, in the region, on the ground, and in support of you know, of less polarisation and peacemaking, basically. And unfortunately, the debate outside the region has become so polarised that you don't really see that at all anymore.
Hannah Weisfeld, really fascinating hearing your thoughts and the work of your organisation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're watching the special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, we'll hear how the protests in America are being perceived and received in the Arab world. I'll be joined by a top Palestinian diplomat.
When I went fishing, obviously we was all talking, and then obviously my fishing rod went off. I didn't think nothing of it at first because it was raining, and then obviously it went again, and then obviously that's when I jumped up and realised I think I've got a fish. So I've jumped out of bivvy, grabbed my rod as you do as a fisherman. Next thing I know, like my reel is just screaming. It's just taking out so much line. My friend was like, "Dale, this is seriously something big you've got on the end of this rod. You need to make sure you get this in." So they're all panicking, like, rah, 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 and I'm like, calm down, let me do this myself, otherwise I want to lose the fish. And yeah, it took me 50 minutes to get it in. And when it come in, my friends had to get 2 nets to capture the fish because obviously the size of it. And then when I got it in, we weighed it and it come out at that weight.
It is massive. I'm just looking at the footage of it now. I'd have been quite scared if that had come out of the water.
Well,
Is it officially the UK's biggest fish? Have you had it confirmed yet?
No, people have said it's the biggest come out so far. That's on record. But obviously, I need to see it in writing to say, yes, this is the biggest so far. I'm the one in the grey trousers, and my friend who I met there that night, Danny, is the one in the red.
I mean, that is a sense of scale. We've all got family members who have got those framed fishing photos, right, holding a big fish. That one of you lying next to the fish. Tell me you're going to get that framed.
I'm going to get it framed. I tried to hold the fish, but obviously where it's so heavy, I couldn't even physically push it up on its side. It was that heavy. Let me just lay next to it and have a photo.
You have to throw them back, don't you? And we're just seeing some footage of the fish going back in the water. Could you throw it back at 143 pounds? How did you get it back in?
We had to pass it, bring it near the water in the sling and lower it in, and obviously open the sling and let it swim out.
Welcome back to a special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim, looking at the protests that have been taking place on university campuses across the United States. Let's not forget what the protests are about. Now, on October the 7th last year, Hamas fighters smashed through the border from Gaza into Israel. More than 1,200 people were killed and more than 240 were taken hostage. The Israeli Prime Minister promised to destroy Hamas, and so began the war in Gaza. In the first 6 days alone, Israel dropped more than 6,000 bombs on the Gaza Strip, decimating entire neighborhoods and wiping out multiple generations of families. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, in almost 7 months of war, more than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed and almost 80,000 have suffered injuries. The UN says 1.7 million people have been displaced and more than 1 million face catastrophic food insecurity. Well, as demonstrations take place over the dire situation there in Gaza, many taking part in the US have been accused of anti-Semitism. Danny Dayan, the chair of the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial, has described what's happening as a cancerous process. He's been speaking to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkel.
You wrote recently to the president of Columbia University in New York. Why did you feel compelled to?
What we are witnessing in the elite campuses, especially in the United States, is a cancerous process. The elimination of Israel is part now of the legitimate discourse, I would even say the prevalent discourse, in many universities in America and in Europe, Columbia included. Even if you don't intend to kill all the Jews of Israel, just to remove them, just to deny them from their liberty, just to deny them from their right for self-determination, that is deeply anti-Semitic.
You referenced Heidelberg University in the 1930s during the growth of Nazism in Germany. Do you see comparisons then?
We are not in the eve of a Nazi regime or anything like that. Well, look, when thousands of faculty, staff and students in a university call for the abolition of the Jewish state and the elimination of Zionism, they have a problem.
Why do you think there is such a big body of opinion that is protesting against Israel? Not just, as we know, in the United States, but in capital cities across Europe as well.
I have no opposition to people protesting against Israel's policies, including in Gaza. The calls to eradicate the state of Israel, whether you do it, you say it explicitly, or with the euphemism of from the river to the sea, that is genocidal, because if you deny from the Jewish people, and only from the Jewish people, its right of self-determination, you hate Jews, simply like that.
That's Danny Dayan speaking to our Alistair Bunkel there. Well, listening to that interview was Majid Bamia, Palestinian Deputy Observer to the UN, who joins me now. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. So you heard there the views in Israel towards these demonstrations in campuses in the United States. But just give us a sense of what your views are, because, of course, you're sitting there in New York, you know, and some of these demonstrations were happening quite close to where you are.
So the question is, who is being denied the right to self-determination? Who is being pushed out? It's the Palestinian people. Who is being killed now in a massive manner? And I am concerned more not about the people who find this outrageous, but by the people who try to justify that. Protesting against a ceasefire is okay, but protesting for a ceasefire, for stopping the killing of tens of thousands of civilians would not be okay. And because we are here in the United Nations, this is a global phenomenon of rejection of these Israeli massacres against the Palestinian people. There is outrage across the world, across generations, across faith, across nationalities. And so the attempts to characterize these movements as anti-Semitic is ridiculous. And anti-Semitism accusation is a serious matter, and we should all fight anti-Semitism and racism. But shielding Israel through that accusation is not acceptable. Yesterday, the Israeli permanent representative said that people who were in favor of the two-state solution and the admission of the state of Palestine to the UN were anti-Semites who wanted the destruction of Israel and collaborators of the Nazis. So if you want equal rights, you are anti-Semite. If you want two-state solution, you are anti-Semite. That's the way Israel, that's the only argument remaining in their bag to say we are entitled to kill civilians and we are shielded from any accountability.
Mr. Bamia, I want to shift your attention now to the situation on the ground. In the last few days, we've heard Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say, come what may, we are going to go into Rafah, with or without a ceasefire, with or without a deal. Just your concerns and reaction to that.
Again, this is because of the lack of accountability. This is impunity. And therefore, the problem is not the people who are asking to ban selling weapons to Israel, to hold Israel accountable. The problem is the ones shielding Israel from accountability. Those who are giving weapons to Israel that allows it to continue to perpetrate these crimes. And therefore, now Rafah, where they have pushed over 1.4 million Palestinians into that very small area where they're using starvation as a method of war, where bombardments are continuing, where they've destroyed all the requirements of life anywhere else. They're saying that little place that we are bombing currently, we're going to invade it. And the whole world is saying no.
Mr. Bamia,
Israel
I just
could care
want to know,
less.
Is there a sense that, this invasion of Rafah is imminent? And if so, is there an idea of what the plan is to move these Palestinians, the 1.4 that you talk about, elsewhere? Are you hearing about any sort of plan?
There is no viable plan. They kept moving people saying there is somewhere safe in Gaza. There is nowhere safe in Gaza. And Israel made sure no one was safe in Gaza and no place was safe in Gaza, because the point is to push people outside of the Gaza Strip, is to resolve the Palestinian question through killing, forcible displacement and subjugation of the Palestinian people.
Do you see from
how many red lines does Israel have to cross for a reaction to finally be at the level of the crimes that are being committed?
The Israeli response on Rafah is that they need to do whatever it takes to destroy Hamas. They say that, they perpetrated October 7, they killed 1,200 Israeli civilians and soldiers, and they have these hostages in Gaza. They need to destroy Hamas. That is the response from Israel.
So because we have prisoners, because we are under occupation, because we have endured massacres after massacres, we would be entitled to kill Israeli civilians left and right. There's reason why there are rules. These are rules that govern everybody. Palestinian civilians are not less civilians than the others. Our lives and our children's lives are not less worthy than the lives of others. It is unacceptable to justify what is happening in Gaza that amounts to genocide by Israel's need to security. This is exactly what Israel has been doing for 75 years. It is generating insecurity for everyone. We want to have peace and live side by side as international law provides for. Israel says its enemy is the Palestinian state, its Palestinian self-determination. It's our very existence. So its excuses are irrelevant. The reality of its policy is it doesn't want the Palestinians. Its fight is against all of the Palestinian people, and that's why it's killing, displacing, and harming Palestinians as a whole. And that's why you have this global movement of solidarity across the world that we appreciate and salute.
Majid Bamia, thank you very much for joining us. You're watching this special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, we'll look at how big of a threat the student protests are to President Biden's hopes for re-election, as polls suggest most Americans disapprove of his handling of the war. welcome back. President Biden has condemned the protests at America's universities, saying they will not change his policies towards the conflict. But there are signs that his handling of the Israel-Hamas war is hitting his popularity. Well, joining us now from Washington is Kevin Kiley, a Republican representative for California. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program. First of all, your reaction to the scenes that we saw overnight in UCLA.
Well, it's absolutely horrifying what we're seeing, and it should never have been allowed to get to this point. I mean, you have horrifying scenes like I never thought I'd see in this country at our universities. You have these illegal encampments that have been growing and growing. You have at UCLA, you had students, well, a lot of them not students, outside agitators that are physically blocking the entrance to campus for Jewish students specifically, or the entrance to libraries. We've had people get attacked. And this should never have been allowed to happen. You know, universities have their own policies against camping, against sleeping on public grounds. These things are against the law to commit acts of violence, to threaten violence, to obstruct people's movement. And yet the university leadership just let it happen. And so I have been calling...
Do you think, though, the right response was the result we're seeing today, where the situation escalated to the point where we're getting reports now that 2,000 American students have been arrested?
Absolutely. Those who are breaking the law and obstructing the rights of others and stopping students from being able to get on campus and get to class.
I mean, some of the images we were seeing, some of the images that were coming out globally were professors, totally unarmed, standing on a lawn, being sort of brutally handled by the police who confronted professors and those students who were, as you say, setting up these tent cities, and the university, said that they needed to remove them. But the handling of the police and the way that they went in there and sort of created what some of their professors are telling me is the violence that we saw.
Well, first of all, the violence has started with those who are setting up these tent encampments and have been targeting specifically Jewish students on campus. Now, when it comes to the police, of course, they have an obligation to use reasonable force and not to exceed reasonable force in doing what is necessary to stop violations of the law. That is the legal obligation of the police. But the fact is, it never would have reached this point if we had had universities that are simply enforcing the law and enforcing their rules in a calm, even-handed manner from the very beginning. Instead, they allowed one tent, they allowed more tent, and the problem has escalated.
I spoke to a professor from Columbia just about half an hour ago on this program, and she said it initially had almost a carnival feel about it, and that she didn't hear any anti-Semitic statements from the students. And it only escalated when the police were brought in by the university president. But I also want to put another point to you. I mean,
I'm sorry, I need to just clarify. That is absolutely false. We had a hearing with the president of Columbia, I guess it was about a week and a half ago. At that point, you hadn't really seen the situation get to anything like it is right now in terms of what's going on in the encampments and everything else. We had many documented instances of outright anti-Semitic behavior, not only from students and others on campus, but from faculty on campus that the university had not sufficiently addressed.
So
this has been a huge problem.
And I've spoken to Jewish students as well on this program who have expressed their concerns and fears around being on campus. And I've also spoken to students who have said that they were peacefully protesting. But I just want to put the point around protest and cracking down on protests. I was also speaking to demonstrators from Egypt, for example, people within the Arab world who have also faced a crackdown from authoritarian regimes there. And they say the situation in America is horrifying them and is probably going to be used against them by their leaders because, they don't expect that to happen in America.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think that what's happening
is part of democracy, as President Biden said.
What's happening on our campus right now is doing a grave injustice to those who are legitimately protesting in a way that is consistent with free speech in places around the world where whether it's, and here as well, the right to protest is fundamental. That's in our First Amendment. What's happening when you have people that are issuing threats, that are blocking people from coming onto campus, that are occupying buildings, that are blasting loud music so nothing else can happen? These things are not consistent. These are not examples of speech. And so you've had universities like University of Florida, for example. It's been very clear. You're allowed to speak your mind. You're allowed to protest. You're allowed to express yourself in any number of ways. What you're not allowed to do is infringe on the rights of others by engaging in unlawful conduct.
So, Congressman, to be clear, you're not sort of creating or calling for some kind of cancel culture on these protesters. You're saying they can protest as long as they abide by the rules and the law of the university.
Absolutely. Anyone has the right to speak their mind on any topic. And no matter how fundamentally I disagree with someone, it is in the very foundation of our country that you have the right to speak your mind and to engage in protest, which is why for folks who want to protest in a peaceful way, whatever the topic might be, I am the strongest supporter of that. I have sponsored legislation called the Free Speech on Campus Act precisely because I think universities don't do a good enough job of protecting freedom of speech. That's not what's going on here. When you occupy a campus and stop people from getting into class and attack students and stand in their way going to the library, that is not speech. That is conduct that violates the law, and it needs to be punished.
Okay, Congressman, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
Let's go back to our James Matthews, who remains in Washington. And James, I'm speaking to a Republican congressman there. We were hearing over the last 24 hours, Republican lawmakers, senators, all talking on this issue. In some way, this is a gift for them because, of course, we can see what's going on in the polls and the anger and frustration that's been directed at President Joe Biden and the Democrats over their handling of the situation in the Middle East and these protests.
Yeah, you're right, Yalda. I think we got there a sense of the blame game, fingers being pointed left, right and centre. The American public at large, all they see is a mess that needs to be brought under control and that so far has not been. And President Biden can only suffer for scenes like this. I mean, this is peaceful protest here at George Washington University, but we have seen violence. And if you contemplate how this may play into the election, just think about the words of Donald Trump, words spoken in a New York courtroom today. On his way in, he said that the protest on campus was to do with red left lunatics who would not be allowed to run the United States. His self-portrait, Donald Trump, as the problem solver, who would solve this. His subtext clearly being what he would characterize as Joe Biden's weakness and inability to shape events. Of course, it's all rooted in his inability to influence in a way he would like the Middle East conflict. That's reflected in polls. Let me read you one, Yalda, that shows how badly he's doing on that. A poll was taken that showed 32.3% of Americans thought he was doing a good job of handling the Israel-Hamas conflict, but a majority, 62.2%, did not approve of the way he was handling it. It will worry him politically. This all has the look of anti-Vietnam War protests from 50 years ago. That will chill the White House, who will be concerned not just at the scenes they see on university campuses, but the prospect that it might extend beyond campus walls.
James, thank you so much for that update there. You're watching the special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, we'll return to Los Angeles as the protest encampment at the University of California is cleared.
And now it's coming from both sides and it's moving this way.
Only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, and it's evident that the boat is seriously overcrowded. This is one of the most severe viruses in the world.
I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is going to be the biggest party Tripoli has ever seen.
That's it got us then. There's a lot of action going on, a lot of hits coming in still. We aim to be the best and the most trusted place in news.
Clearly not had very much to eat at all. A lot of them extremely thin and very frail. Look at her arms. I can put my entire hand round.
This is the cocktail of drugs which the doctors at this hospital have been giving their coronavirus patients. Made for people who want clarity in an uncertain world.
Mother Nature can be vicious, absolutely savage. The world's largest falls now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Whoa!
Close and personal with a rhino.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Welcome back to our special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Hundreds of people have been arrested at the University of California after police stormed the protest camp. Well, let's go back to our Mark Stone, who is there. And Mark, we've been hearing a range of views throughout the programme. You told us a little bit earlier about things clearing up there, but we don't know if this is the end of it.
We don't. You can see them continuing to clear up here. There are some police here. These are from the LAPD, a very small number, as you can see. The question is whether or not the protesters will decide to come back. This is a large campus. It's sprawling. It's a public university. A lot of people could come here if they want, and the question will be whether or not they come back. The other point I would make, Yalda, picking up on what James said before the break, the protesters that were here last night, they are almost certainly likely to be people who would have voted for Joe Biden. They were clearly alienated because of his policies in Gaza. They have been further alienated because of his words this morning. I've little doubt about that. He clearly came down on the side of the police. He was saying that the protests were violent. What we have seen here over the course of the past few days is protests that were not violent in their core. And I think the protesters will be very worried about where this will go, as of course will the authorities.
Mark, thank you for all of your reporting there. And of course, we will continue to monitor the situation. Well, as we've been reporting from across the United States, a very dramatic week. Thank you very much for watching our special edition. We'll be back next week. The news at 10 is next. Good night for now.